Ari Rosenbaum here with another fun-filled episode of the 401k podcast. This week's topic, we're going to talk about the three C's, why plan sponsors can't afford to be cheap, controlling, and clueless. But of course, first things first, go to that 401ksite.com. Further information on all our events, just a couple months away, Milwaukee, September the 5th, Friday. For those who want to join us, we'll have a couple game tickets for Wednesday the 4th at, I think, 4 o'clock in Milwaukee. And of course, we'll have announcements on that national virtual conference for next year. And then July, August, we'll look at the schedule and see what we're going to do for events for 2026. May do Vegas, may not. We'll see how the schedule aligns and some other cities as well. But let's get to the topic at hand. I usually record on a Friday or sometimes Sunday, Monday, whatever. Today's Thursday before the 4th. I want to get that in there. But I can't believe, but time really flies. It's almost 30 years that I've been in this business. I worked for a TPA. I was a risk attorney, still am. Playing document drafter. And, an occasional therapist to frantic plan sponsors and plan providers. There's so many horror stories, lawsuits, missed deferral opportunities, and more, so many poor fund lineups that I could count. But if there's a recurring theme that I've seen in the past, almost 30 years, it's that too many plan sponsors are completely asleep at the wheel. They want the best for their employees, sure, but the problem is they get cheap, they get controlling, and worst of all, they get complacent. And that kind of trifecta, it's not good for what might be good for horse race betting. It's not good for this situation for plan sponsors. It's really bad for business, and it's a roadmap to fiduciary liability. Number one is really, what I consider the silent killer of 401k plans, and that's really complacency. And complacency is usually what happens when plan sponsors assume that no news is good news. They don't, do their job in reviewing investments. They haven't benchmarked their fees in quite some time. And when the fiduciary committee hasn't met since the Bush administration, either the first or second Bush, they don't care because nobody's complained and nothing happens. But silence doesn't mean that everything is going okay. It usually means that no one is paying attention. Not the participants, not the advisor, and certainly not the plan sponsor. But the problem is the DOL or an enterprising class action law firm is going to start paying attention once they smell blood in the water. Fiduciary duty isn't about just sitting back and doing nothing. You can't coast. It's all about prudence and loyalty, two things you can't, claim if your entire oversight process is a quarterly check-in call you take on speakerphone while checking emails. I will say that over the past, almost 30 years, plan sponsors have been less complacent. The lawsuits, the litigation has really woken up, and good conversations by plan providers about fiduciary responsibility. 15 years ago, people like me and James Holland, I always think of, we were told that we were selling fear about talking about fiduciary responsibility and whatnot. And, obviously, thanks to litigation, thanks to fee disclosure, that all changed. The problem is if a plan sponsor, if their fiduciary process, is just that check-in, it's just not right. We didn't know, is it really a get out of jail free card? It's an invitation to a deposition. And I always goof on my old law firm. And why do I goof? I goof on it because, again, they didn't know what they were doing, and I tried to help them, gave them some advisors to talk to, and of course they didn't hire the advisor that I recommended, which I thought was, insulting to me. But this was a $25 million 401k plan, and they were going to get sued if they didn't clean the stuff up. That's really, what happens. And that was complacency. But like I said, we don't see it as often as we used to. And another one of the three C's is being cheap, and plan sponsors can't afford to be cheap. And one of the most aggravating things I see as an ERISA attorney is how some plan sponsors out there treat their retirement plan like a garage sale. You know, they'll say like they want to go for the cheapest plan provider out there, and it doesn't really work that way. I think you see that mostly. I think the one provider everybody tries to cheap out the most is the auditor. And if some accountant selling a $5,000 audit, I don't want to buy it because chances are the Department of Labor is going to say that's deficient. That's just not the market go rate for an audit. And years ago, when I first came up with the idea about the Muslim M law firm, I think I talked about it at least in one of the books that I did, and of course, don't forget, Full Circle is available on Kindle and paperback. But the Rosenbaum Law Firm started about 10 years before I actually went out on my own. I had it as like a side business that none of my bosses knew about. And the first idea for the Rosenbaum Law Firm was I was going to do, wills for like $100 and do taxes for $150 and whatnot. And it was a poor idea. Why was it a poor idea? Because nobody should, legal services isn't like something like, toothpaste at Walmart. They're not going to go for the lowest price. I tried to be like the Walmart legal services and tried to use that idea, and it just was a bad idea because when you are selling something so cheap, you never make it up in bulk. We have there's a weird guy here where I live, and his big shtick is he only takes 1% commissions on real estate. So that means no property can be sold on MLS. And I don't know what kind of business model is. I'm only going to take 1%. I'm going to forego 3% because I think the going rate now is 4% on. So it's like you never make it up in bulk, and so I just don't understand why people would pick the cheapest plan provider. Just like I learned that people aren't going to pick an attorney based on the lowest price. A 401k plan, isn't a cable bill where you shop around every couple of years. It's a legally protected trust governed by one of the most complex pieces of federal law, which is ERISA. If you're running a $5 million 401k plan and you balk at paying $700 for one of my retirement plan tune-ups, you're missing the point. And that's why, again, the cost and complacency. I've done less than 10 of these in 16 years. That's because, that $750 could be worthwhile because it could uncover major compliance issues, excessive fees, or a fun lineup that looks like it was chosen by a dartboard. I talk about the medical practice where, the advisor was making, hand over fist. He was making about, something like 60 bips on a $14 million plan, and he was doing absolutely nothing. And as a result, the plan chose a 338 instead of a broker, and went with one of the well-known 338s out there, and they were charging 25 bips, saving a boatload of money. Instead of paying 84 grand in fees, they were paying a lot less. They were paying like 35,000. So the real cost isn't the fee of that $750 that I'm charging. It's the risk of getting sued because you didn't know what you didn't know. Free in this business is rarely free. Hidden fees, rev share, conflicts of interest, those come with a cost, and it's your participants that are going to foot the bill. And, as opposed to complacency, we also run into trouble with plan sponsors that are control freaks. And I can say, admit it that I'm a control freak in a lot of respects, in how I run my events and how I do things. And there was probably a reason why I could never work for anybody because I think I knew what was best. I wanted to control my own destiny. So, my ideas was, my idea was that, I could do better than these managing attorneys and law firm partners who are just going to regulate what I can do to just generate business. And of course, as it says in the book, I was a malcontent. I always was a malcontent, and that's okay. But, some plan sponsors, the problem with control is they think they're the second coming of Walter Buffett because they read a financial article in Forbes. And the funny part is the plan sponsors who think that the most are usually doctors. But they override their advisors. They pick exotic funds. They saw on CNBC. They dictate plan operations as their personal 401k plan, and they also obviously offer a self-directed brokerage account. But the problem with being a control freak without expertise doesn't make you prudent. It makes you dangerous. See, I'm a control freak with running my events. I have a history and experience of running my events, all the way back to when I was doing, hosting comedy nights with Sal the Stockbroker at my old synagogue. I was a control freak back then because we had a fundraising guy who was terrible at what he was doing, and he would never advertise the events in advance. I like to advertise events way in advance so people know about it, and so I don't have to do everything at the last minute. And, trying to be an expert without the expertise, it's just a dangerous recipe. I've seen plan sponsors unilaterally swap out target date funds based on their gut feeling. There are people who delay compliance testing because they don't trust the results from the TPA. Some use it as a sandbox to do personal asset management, and that's malpractice. And you don't have to know everything about ERISA, but the law says if you don't, you need to hire someone who does, and that's why plan sponsors need to hire an advisor, TPA, and the ERISA attorney. You can't micromanage a plan when you don't understand the basics of ERISA. And of course, speaking of doctors, the other, plan sponsor that's difficult to manage are law firms dealing with non-ERISA attorneys. Attorneys are arrogant. I know. I went to law school. I went to 4 years of law school, 3 years law school, 1 year tax LLM. I know why people don't like attorneys, and non-ERISA attorneys think they know ERISA, and it's a totally different animal. Speaking of mismanagement in plain sight, there's so many plans out there that are mismanaged. No one notices until the IRS and Department of Labor come knocking. I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of plans over the years. I've seen eligibility provisions that contradict the SPD, missed deferral opportunities, investment lineups that haven't been touched since the iPhone 4, and service providers who got the job because they sponsor the charity golf outing, or I had a plan sponsor avoid hiring, the plan provider that was, doing the literature table at their industry event. Just because, the plan runs without someone screaming doesn't mean it's running well. Most ERISA mistakes are discovered on an audit or when there's a change in the TPA. Section 408B2, issues. We have plan sponsors who don't read them and all that kind of stuff. And there's fiduciary committees that exist in name only, which is a chapter in my book Full Circle where I joke, talking about committees. I talk about the old managing attorney at my old law firm that if she wanted to avoid a situation and not deal with it, she would create a committee for it, like she did with social media. And you have a lot of plan sponsors who have committees that just don't meet, and that's a problem because that's a breach of the process if you have a process and you don't follow it. Plan sponsors really need to do better. There's no excuse for it. It's not too late. The reality is, it might be too late if you're on autopilot, but there's always a chance to change. If you want to do right as a plan sponsor, it's just not brain surgery. What plan sponsors could do to get better and avoid these 3 C's. Obviously, benchmark the fees at least every 3 years, preferably annually. Obviously, the larger the plan, more often you have to do it. It's important to hire really good plan providers out there, and more importantly, trust them. Also, follow the investment policy statement, and if you don't have one, write one. Train a fiduciary committee. Yes, training is a thing. I've written so many articles about the needs for a committee and organizational drift and bad organizational culture and all that. You got to avoid that. Document everything because memories fade, but memos don't. Make sure that everything is up to snuff, everything's written, and everything's put away. That's always important. You need a roadmap, how you got there, and how you followed it. It's also important that a plan sponsor, not afraid to spend a little money for good advice. It's a lot cheaper than dealing with a lawsuit or a DOL investigation. A 401k plan is not a set it and forget it appliance. It's a living, breathing employee benefit that requires care, attention, and a little humility. You don't have to be perfect as a plan sponsor, but you are expected to be responsible. Don't be cheap. Don't be complacent. Don't be a control freak. You, as a fiduciary, you have a fiduciary responsibility to plan participants. You owe yourself the peace of mind that you're not one bad audit away from disaster. Because let's face it, the DOL doesn't hand out participation trophies; they hand out subpoenas. And you know what else? When something does go wrong, and trust me, it eventually will, the same plan sponsors who are just too cheap, too controlling, and too complacent are the ones who panic and start pointing fingers. They'll blame the advisor, they'll blame the TPA, but they will never look at themselves in the mirror. And as a plan sponsor, you have to be aware it's on you. The buck stops with you. And you could have hired better plan providers out there, but when you put a process in place, and this is what happens, too bad. That's really the nature of it. That's part of the game, and that's really the situation with plan sponsors and the issues that go on with them. And complacency and control and being too cheap. These are just the issues, some of the issues that we deal with. I've dealt with, especially as a risk attorney. So that's it for this episode of that 401k podcast. Full Circle, my book. I've sold at least double-digit copies already, thankfully. Nice to see that people are reading it. It's available on Kindle and it's available in paperback, only on Amazon.com. Go to that 401ksite.com, Milwaukee. 5 hours of content, lunch, stadium tour, meet and greet with a brewer. Great. We can do that. That's on Friday, September 5th. And, of course, we'll have the National Virtual Conference information up very, very soon. And again, hope you tune in next week for another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. Take care.